Hello and welcome everyone to the Intruvable Chamber. I want to start this presentation on Joan of Arc by reading a segment from Mark Twain, his personal recollections on Joan of Arc, which he contrived a way of him presenting this as a history, as him translating a document from a fictional confidant, one Jean-Francois Alden. And this is on the purity of Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc is purity from alloy of self-seeking, self-interest, personal ambition. In it, no trace of these motives can be found. Search as you may, and this cannot be said of any other person who appears in profane history. With Joan of Arc, love of country was more than a sentiment, it was a passion. She was the genius of patriotism. She was patriotism embodied, concreted, made flesh and palpable to the touch and visible to the eye. Love, mercy, charity, fortitude, war, peace, poetry, music, these may be symbolized by any who shall prefer any of those of any age, of any sex. But a slender girl, in her first young bloom, with a martyr's crown and sword that severed her country's bonds, shall not this and no other stand for patriotism through all the ages until time itself shall end? Of course, Mark Twain, writing a fictional account, emphasizes this key word regarding Joan of Arc, profane history. How does one take a figure, Joan of Arc, who, just to summarize, starts off as a peasant girl in the extreme east of France, a small village known as Domremy. From the age of 13, she begins hearing voices. We can interpret what those voices essentially entail. She then goes off to a walled settlement of Vaucouleurs, is able to convince Robert de Baudricourt and Bertrand de Poligny that she has in fact received a divine revelation. She goes off to the court of the exiled king or Dauphin Charles VII at Chinon, undergoes a religious trial at Poitiers, is sent and given command of the armies of France at the siege of Orleans. She liberates the besiegers and delivers France a victory in 5 days after months of grueling siege warfare. She leads the forces of France on a march towards Reims, ensuring that the exiled king, the Dauphin, is crowned King of France. She then continues her fight, is taken at the siege of Compiègne by the Burgundians, a force hostile to the king in alliance with the English. She is then delivered to the English to be put on trial at Rouen, and she is found guilty and burnt at the stake for heresy. From this, we can take many interpretations of Joan of Arc in terms of her role in profane history, divorced from the sacralizing aspect of seeing this as a symptom of real prophecy of divine revelation. We can look at her as a legitimist heroine, a Catholic saint, or a nationalist idol, and emphasize the word idol. I mean all of the implications of idolatry in the Christian sense. All of these aspects, the pejorative in the extreme and the salutary in the extreme, have been applied to the figure of Joan of Arc, who has figured so prominently in medieval history and in our worship of aspects of medievalism and the child saint ever since. Indeed, to contrast this and focus on the idea of a nationalist idol, I just want to reference one line of dialogue from Shakespeare's Henry VI, Part 1. And this is coming from the words of Charles VII himself, from the lips of Charles VII himself. No longer on Saint Denis shall we cry, but Joan le Passerelle, the maid, shall be France's saint. Now, into that one line of dialogue, Shakespeare is just dripping with irony and sarcasm. On the one hand, he is mocking the pretensions of the French cause during the 100 Years, saying that the crown of France in exile, according to the so-called King of Bourges, which is what the Dauphin was derisively known as, has decided to pin his colours, almost in a literal sense, to the cause of a peasant girl hearing voices, a peasant girl who has been deemed a witch, deemed a harlot, and a heretic, and any other thing you can possibly label her. And it is that this woman should be the one, essentially, that shall deliver France and shall supersede all of the other saints of France to become her national icon. And in the end, Shakespeare demeans the figure of Joan the Maid by having her claim that she is with child, having held fast to the idea of her personal virginity, and then goes through a list of members of the French court, hoping to find one that the English will take pity on in terms of the child being of that venerable scion, the bastard child of Joan of Arc, the Maid. And yet there is a ironic quality to all that. Despite what Shakespeare's intention would have been when he put those words into the mouth of Charles VII, it has become true, because she has become France's saint. She has completely superseded our understanding of Saint Denis or even Saint Louis. Indeed, during the 20th century, she did become a saint, so Shakespeare may have meant it as sarcasm, but in the end it became prophecy. And this is where we get to the fundamental crux of this conversation, how to involve in profane history into a materialist understanding or reading of history, the role of the prophet, the anti-historical personality, the role of the religious warrior. This isn't unprecedented. You only need to look at the First Crusade, the real First Crusade under Peter the Hermit, and how disastrously it went. How then we can incorporate certain elements of, I'm just going to throw these out there, such as Max Weber's secularized charismatic authority or charismatic personality, but also this underlying contradiction or friction between the ideas of a military cause that is willed by God, or an armed pilgrimage in the form of the crusade, or a military cause which is merely consented to by God, wherein God gives perhaps a gentle nod of approval. And I want to begin this segment by reading from Thomas Carlyle on heroes and hero worship, on the purported falsity of revelation. Are we to suppose that it was a miserable piece of spiritual legerdemain, this which so many creatures of the Almighty have lived and died by? The ironic thing is that he meant this in reference to the Prophet Muhammad, but it is equally applicable to the way that people were able to become so cultivated and adored to Joan of Arc. Continuing on the prophet, sincerity, a deep, great, genuine sincerity, is the first characteristic of all men or women in any way heroic. Not the sincerity that calls itself sincere. No, that is a very poor matter indeed, a shallow braggart, conscious sincerity, often a self-conceit mainly. And again, significant sort of running theme throughout the character of Joan of Arc. Is this an act, as someone like Shakespeare would present it as, or is this a divinely revealed mission, and that this plain peasant girl has taken it to become the manifestation of the voices of the Archangel Michael and the two saints, Catherine of Alexandria and Margaret of Antioch? The great man's sincerity is of a kind he cannot speak of. It's not conscious, I suppose. He is conscious rather of insincerity, for what man can walk accurately by the law of truth for one day? No, the great man does not boast himself sincere, far from that, perhaps does not ask himself if he is so. I would say rather his sincerity does not depend on himself, he cannot help being sincere. And again, if we're going to talk about the role of a character and the whole sort of Christian conception of prophecy and truth, an element that needs to be added to that, of course, is the aspect of humility. And she is asked about her revelations many times throughout her trials and tribulations. The great fact of existence is great to him, the existence of these visions in the case of Joan of Arc. Fly as he will, he cannot get out of the awful presence of this reality. His mind is so made, he is great by that. First of all, fearful and wonderful, real as life, real as death, is the universe to him. Though all men should forget its truth and walk in vain show, he cannot, or she cannot. At all moments the flame image glares in upon him, undeniable. There, I wish you to take this as my primary definition of a great man. And what Carlyle is really referencing here when he means the great man is the great man in history. So ironically, he is talking about the role of the individual in terms of being able to prostrate himself before and determine the facts of profane history, whereas Joan of Arc is simultaneously transcending our conception of profane history, and yet undeniably she is one of these great actors who is able to transform our conception of history of France during the 1420s and 30s. A little man may have this. It is competent to all men that God has made, but a great man cannot be without it. And you can say that the flame image that glares is, of course, associated with the literal flames and embers of Joan of Arc, and the heart that cannot ever be destroyed. Such a man is that we may call an original man, and of course Joan of Arc is nothing if not original in that sense. He comes to us at first hand, a messenger he sent from infinite unknown with tidings to us. We may call him a prophet, poet, God. In one way or other, we all feel the words he utters are no other man's words. And yet in the case of Joan of Arc, she would say that they are none other than the words of God. Direct from the inner fact of things, he lives and has to live in daily communion with that. With Joan of Arc, we can say daily communion with those voices and that reality. Hearsays cannot hide it from him. He is blind, hopeless, miserable, following hearsays. It glares upon him. Really is his utterances, are they not a kind of revelation? What we must call such for what some other name? It is from the heart of the world that he comes. He is portion of the primal reality of things. God has made many revelations, but this man too, has not God made him, the latest and newest of all? The inspiration of Almighty giveth him understanding. We must listen before all to him. So moving on from the more abstract notions of history, I want to come to the prophecies, the real prophecies associated with Joan of Arc. One, of course, sort of comes from the Venerable Bede, or not of course, but the Venerable Bede did ostensibly prophesize the coming of Joan of Arc. But perhaps more pertinent to this discussion is the prophecy of Merlin, Merlin of Geoffrey of Monmouth, Merlin of the Matter of Britain, Merlin and King Arthur. Merlin had a particular prophecy, ostensibly, that France will one day be lost by a woman and won by a woman. Another translation is that France will be lost by a woman and won by a maid. The association at the time that the woman who had lost France was the then Queen of France, the wife to the mad Charles VI, Isabella of Bavaria. It helped that she was foreign, so as to emphasize that Joan's cause was purely the cause of France. I think if you're going to take this prophecy seriously, you can perhaps also read into it the Tour de Nesle affair, which I may come to later regarding the cause of Joan of Arc actually being the cause of royal legitimacy, more so than a purely nationalistic or patriotic cause, as the previous readings may possibly give us that impression. And this is an article by Deborah Fraioli, The Literary Image of Joan of Arc. The prophecy is about a virgin who would destroy the English, like the association of Joan with biblical heroines, added legitimacy to Joan of Arc's mission. The peasant girl from Don Remy, who had not only been elevated to the rank of a Deborah or Judith in the Bible, but now a number of disparate strands of other prophetic traditions converged on her, bestowing on her mission an ample feeling of authority, rightness, and inevitability. Although God did not figure directly in these prophecies, the implication in the 15th century was that Merlin and the other seers were revealing fragments of a greater divine plan. Furthermore, the prophecies offered additional prototypes for the female warrior. Mary Robin's voices told of a virgin who would bear arms, and the Merlin prophecies placed the virgin armed on horseback in the middle of the fray. Thus, the prophecies lent respectability to the idea of the virgin who actually engages in combat, going one step further but reinforcing the military image derived from the biblical Deborah. Nowhere is this effect of the prophecies on Joan of Arc's image more striking than in the widely distributed 16-line Latin poem that begins with the words Virgo Pualis, which is the virgin girl, effectively. Here we find the Dauphin's official propagandists composing their own prophetic poem, modelled after the Merlin prophecies and capitalizing on the association with the dual intention of increasing Joan's stature and launching her as a formidable opponent to the English. The image of the virgin warrior in the Virgo Pualis departs in obvious ways from the one in the Merlin prophecies. The primary concern of the Merlin prophecy was a campaign into England, but the preoccupations of the Virgo are solely French. Reference is made to the fleur-de-lis, the enemy at Orleans, and the Virgin dressed in men's clothing, who is currently making preparations. Another new element is the notion of divine mission, Dei Monitu, not present in the Merlin prophecies. whereas Ex Namore Canuto, which was another poem, gained a pleasing mystical quality for its non-specific Celtic allusions. The Virgo maintains the same air of mystery and authority by making Joan's mission an act of divine will. Nevertheless, the aggressive tone of the poem, with the prospects for victory centering on military action of a woman, is taken from the Merlin prophecies. Without the precedent of the Merlin prophecies, it would have been almost unthinkable to portray Joan of Arc as a kind of feminine Mars before she had left the Dauphin to raise the siege of Orleans. This article is taken from Alan Llewellyn Barstow, Joan of Arc. First, Joan did not create the role of the female prophet. She modeled her image around a ready-made role, carefully identifying herself with legends about a prophetic virgin wearing armor who would come from the east, from Lorraine. Now, this is where I need to intervene. In the previous segment that I just read, it's very clear that there was a huge emphasis on forming any precedent, any prophetic precedent that could justify the cause of Joan of Arc. And this was to aid the cause of the King of France, the Dauphin, Charles VII. He could not be associated with witchcraft or heresy or any other thing which would impugn his soul and damn his cause and the legitimacy of it. But here, I would say the mistake, or perhaps you can say the underlying sort of implication here by Anne Barstow, is that Joan personally cultivated this image, that Joan was fully aware of the various precedents that existed within French history, and thereby she simply slots herself rather neatly into the archetype, rather than this being a propaganda mill which is being formed around her at the course of her entry into the field of profane history, into the field of French and political life. And as a result of it, we can therefore discredit everything she has to say, or secularize everything she has to say, degrade it to the level of profane history. Given that a consistent element of Joan of Arc is the fact that she was not educated, she was a peasant, and that she could not read, we would have to disabuse ourselves of all of that information if we're going to say that her public image was ready-made to allow herself to identify with a female archetype. And this, you can say, is the issue with some elements of gendered history here. There was the long history of visionary women who had advised royal governments or criticized the church. The independence of thought of many of these lay mystics was as extraordinary as Joan's, and several received equally harsh treatment from church courts, emphasizing that Joan of Arc will end her life as a result of being condemned by the court at Rouen. The first to come to attention of the Inquisitor of Paris was Marguerite Porete, a wandering preacher who, by the mid-1290s, had written A Mirror for Simple Souls, a book describing what she had learned of the mystical ascent culminating in the vision of God. Having experienced these heights, Margaret concluded that she no longer needed theological learning or the sacraments of the church, that these man-made aids were in fact an impediment to spiritual life. At some time before 1306, the book was condemned and burnt in her presence at Valenciennes, and she was threatened with death if she spread her ideas further. Although there is no biography of Margaret, it appears that she did not live in a community, had no confessor or spiritual director, and followed no charismatic preacher. On the contrary, she was on the move, teaching in or sending her book to various cities, Chalon, Tournai, Paris. If Marguerite had been willing to enter a convent, she may have saved herself, but she seems to have been fearless, ordered to show her book to no one. She probably sent it to 3 theologians for their approval, which she received. In both her independence and her unwavering belief in her mission, Margaret was her own. For this intransigent spirit, she was burnt at the stake in 1310. A more dramatic and disturbing case of prophecy is that of Mary Robin, a peasant woman who came on pilgrimage to Avignon in 1387, seeking healing for an illness. Miraculously cured, she settled as a recluse in a cemetery and began to have visions about the papal schism that sees the church divided into the Avignon papacies, the Roman papacy, and in the end there'll be 3 popes, so the Pisan papacy added to that. Traveling to Paris, she managed an interview with Queen Isabel. in which she prophesied what did in fact become true and become policy, that France will withdraw obedience from the Avignon Pope, thereby throwing the French church into crisis. That is the same Queen Isabella, by the way, which the Merlin prophecies attested to as being the woman who would lose France. When Mary returned to Avignon, her visions continued, becoming more pessimistic and apocalyptic. Believing that France would be ravaged by the Antichrist, she reported a radical vision. God told her that since the King of France had done nothing to restore the condition of the Church to unity, we will depose him from the throne by means of his subjects, and many will die in rivers of blood. And one will say, "Here was Paris." These were revolutionary words, which Mary was not wise to utter until she left the capital. Indeed, if you read this, and we're talking about an era of prophecy, and we're talking about the prophecies surrounding Joan of Arc, and Joan of Arc herself being her own prophet, then you can read this and say that she's referring to the Mad King, King Charles VI, who will die in the year 1422 when Joan of Arc is the age of 10, that this is the king who is heralding the scourge of France in the form of Henry V, that this will be anticipating the Battle of Agincourt. So you can read these prophecies many ways, in the sense that it is France and its unwillingness to mend the schism with the church, that France has fallen out of true religion, that the church has or the church militant has been forsaken by France, therefore that the English cause is in some way just. And conversely, in a final vision, Marie saw a vast amount of armor, and fearing that she was intended to wear it, she protested that she could not be a warrior. She was assured that the armor was not for her, but that a maiden who would come afterwards should bear these arms and deliver the kingdom of France from the enemy. People came to believe that Joan was the maiden about whom Mary prophesied, and indeed, while these women limited their role to prophesying and advising, Joan became the agent and activator of the mission she envisioned. Indeed, if you're going to look at Mary Robine and say that she was in many ways actually prophesying the turmoil of the French cause and the coming of the English, that the redemptive cause or arc of France was to be fulfilled by the cause of Joan of Arc. This is moving on to Diane Watts' Reconstructing the Word, Political Prophecies. In the turbulent religious and political climate of late medieval Europe, it seems that prophets and visionaries often had key roles to play. Indeed, prophecy could offer women a rare opportunity for direct involvement in the political sphere. In the second half of the 14th century, two women in particular, Saint Bridget of Sweden and Saint Catherine of Siena, which I've figured on the right of this slide, emerged as important and influential figures. Saint Bridget received revelations concerning the spiritual rebirth of her own country, that of Sweden, and the reformation of the Roman Church. She admonished then King Magnus of Sweden about his failings, criticized the corruption of his court, and attempted to direct his policies. Concerned about international instability, she warned Pope Clement VI to make peace between England and France. Saint Catherine, for her part, attempted to negotiate an end to a conflict which broke out between Florence and the papacy. Saint Bridget and Saint Catherine urged the return of the papacy from Avignon during the Great Schism, which Saint Catherine, supporting the Roman claimant Urban VI and working for his cause. Some, what later at the end of the second decade of the 15th century, Joan of Arc, took a leading part in the Anglo-French conflicts, persuading the Dauphin Charles that she had a divine mission to drive the English out of France. These women prophets came from a range of social and religious backgrounds. Saint Bridget of Sweden was of aristocratic birth. She married and had children, but lived as a penitent after the death of her husband. Saint Catherine of Siena was a daughter of a lower-class tradesman. She remained unmarried and became a Dominican tertiary. Joan of Arc was a laywoman from a peasant family. Indeed, you could look even further than the example of Joan of Arc, and you can go to figures such as Elizabeth Barton. And this is the emphasis when finally Joan of Arc arrives at Chinon in terms of substantiating all of these treatises and ideas about her. Jean Girard, the president of the Grenoble Parlement, and a close associate of the king, or the Dauphin Charles, cited Deborah, Judith, and the Sibyls as precedents of Joan of Arc in his correspondence with the Archbishop of Embrun, Jacques Gelou, the purpose of which was to gain Gelou's approbation of the Maid, i.e., church-sanctioned approval. By May of 1429, 3 treatises have been written about the case. All 3 cite examples of biblical women to support all of Joan of Arc, Joan the Maid's claims, and these are De Quadrumpuella, a certain girl, the argumentation of Jacques Gelou, and De Mirabili Victoria, the miraculous victory. And all of these things, you can say, are emphasizing again that this is the girl who was prophesied and the divine mission that would essentially be invited on France. But then we come to a more substantial point. All of these things are emphasizing that there are various precedents to Joan of Arc, that they want to concern themselves with church unity, the reformation of the Catholic Church in general, and for the cause of peace. So how do you take all of this? You take the idea of the unity of broader Christendom and the reformation of the Roman Church, and how can you reconcile that? How does one reconcile that with the cause of France being the cause of Christendom? You can go, say, for example, to Matthew 1:2-3, Gott mit uns, God with us, or Romans 8:3-1, if God is for us or God is with us, who can be against us? These are many nationalistic mottos, where if our cause is the true cause, if our cause is right and just and has God's approval, and it can only be said that our cause can be just with God's approval, will ours be the winning cause or the just cause? Indeed, to look at Gott mit uns, it's the Catholic motto of the Teutonic Order, which is appropriated later by the Protestant Prussians and later by the German army. Look to a later Protestant figure, Elizabeth of England. God's winds blew, and they were scattered, associating the defeat of the Catholic Spanish Armada with the divine intervention of favourable winds for the English. Even going back to Henry V, in Shakespeare, Henry V spends time around his men on the eve of the Battle of Agincourt, and they debate the justice of the cause, that Henry V is the rightful King of France. So on the one hand, you can say that this is just simply ubiquitous with the idea of the just cause, or St. Augustine's notion of the just war. But how can you take that and how can you actually ascribe such motivation or such justice onto France in particular, and onto a figure who now is sainted? And this is what I found quite a revealing line of sort of a contemporary analysis by Pope Pius II. And this was at the retrial of Joan of Arc in 1456, 30 years, or a quarter of a century rather, after the original trial. Whether her career was a miracle of heaven or a device of men, I should find it hard to say. Some think that when the English cause was prospering, one shrewder than the rest evolving the cunning scheme of declaring that the Maid had been sent by heaven and giving her the command she asked for, since there was no man alive who would refuse to have God for his leader. Thus it came about that the conduct of war and the high command was entrusted to a girl. Nor would this have been very difficult to manage with the French, who think hearsay is the same as knowledge. Going back to my purposeful use of Thomas Carlyle at the beginning. It is a phenomenon that deserves to be recorded, although after ages are likely to regard it with more wonder than credulity. And that is very much the verdict of profane history versus Catholic apologetics. And again, take this idea that the cause of France is so pitiable that it has to rely on God leading the armies in the cause of a young peasant girl. So it's here, well, I'll try my best to summarize the cause of the 100 Years' War up until this point into the Siege of Orleans to better contextualize what I'm really talking about. So I mentioned previously the prophecy of Merlin, and that France will be lost by a woman and gained by a woman, or gained by a maid. Well, you can say that the origins of the 100 Years' War lie in again, the political machinations and intrigues of women. One is Isabella of France, the mother of King Edward III of England, and thereby giving Edward III his claim to be King of France. The others are the spouses of the sons of Philip IV, Philip le Fair, Philip the Iron King, and that their infamy had resulted in the situation where the cause for royal women had become so notorious and egregious that only men could sit on the throne of France. And indeed, as the son and grandsons of Philip IV come and fall in very quick succession after the year 1314, not only does succession in the French crown become firmly established as being a male-only privilege, but later it is further substantiated as male in the male line only. There will never be female line male successors by the time that Philip de Valois, Philip the Fortunate, becomes King of France, and the issues regarding the Hundred Years' War begin. So if you're going to look at this as a sort of broader look, as endemic of the whole nature of the Hundred Years' War, then you can say again it is lost by a woman and won by a woman if you're going to look at this and apply prophetic history to the Tour de Nesle affair, where all of these royal brides and mistresses become adulterers. And that discredits them and leads most of them to be imprisoned for the rest of their lives. So moving on from the Hundred Years' War, you could say that the cause of the English is vindicated by a series of military victories. One of them is the military victory at the Battle of Crécy by Edward III himself in, I believe it was the year 1347. The next was the Battle of Poitiers by the Black Prince Edward. And that victory was so stupendous over the French that the King of France, King John, is captured, and once his son, Charles the Bald, actually violates the terms of his ransom, he willingly goes back into English exile and imprisonment. You can say if there is any sort of royal exemplar in the codes of chivalry and the conduct of war, King John de Valois was that exceptional king. And indeed, if we're going to look at the whole cause of the de Valois and the French monarchy as notorious, we have to look at those various examples. But then the cause of the English starts going very badly. I've already mentioned Charles the Bald, or Charles V. He is able to completely undermine the English and all of their gains under Edward III and Edward the Black Prince, the Prince of Wales. And by the year 1380, which is the beginning of the reign of Richard II, virtually all of the gains made have been undone, and the English have once again been reduced to a small pocket of territory that you actually see in this more modern map on the left, which is the area of Gascony, the old Duchy of Aquitaine, which had come to the English during the reign of Henry II by virtue of his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine. Richard II is then deposed by an event in English history known as the usurpation by Henry Bolingbroke. And then something remarkable happens. Henry V had the stain of illegitimacy associated with the fact that his father has deposed the rightful king, and there was a man alive during the time of Henry V who had a better claim to the throne of England than he did. And then Henry V not only asserts that God am I right to be king of England, but also to be king of France, because if the cause of the English during the previous segments of the Hundred Years will be just, and I am rightful king of England, then I am also rightful king of France. This is also a time of turmoil for the cause of France. France has been divided. One of the sons of King John, the Duke of Burgundy, Duke Philip the Bold, had established a very powerful possession within the east of France that you see in the purple. And then, under his son, John the Fearless, the House of Burgundy Valois begins augmenting various territories together, in particular the area of Flanders. And under Philip the Good, the figure is going to feature very prominently in the life of Joan of Arc, Philip the Good begins expanding into Belgium. He begins expanding into the Netherlands and establishing a mighty empire in the center of Europe. And so they have established themselves as great feudal lords within their own right, almost above that of the king himself. Around the time of the son of Charles the Bald, Charles VI, you have the rise of his brother, the Duke of Orleans. And to make matters worse, Charles VI is insane. Charles VI believes he is made of glass. Charles VI has an incident where he murders his own retainers. And it is the rumors of Charles VI's insanity, which helps, or rather the proofs of Charles VI's insanity, that lend credence to the idea that all the sons begotten by him, ostensibly by Queen Isabella of Bavaria, are in fact bastards. And it's into that powder keg, the feud between the Duc d'Orléans and the Duke of Burgundy and the insane King of France, that Henry V stakes his claim to be King of France. At the Battle of Agincourt, the forces of Burgundy do not contribute to the cause of the king, and the vastly superior French army is defeated by an army of extremely talented English longbowmen. And then Henry V returns to England, is able to escape with his army. There are a number of high-profile assassinations, including that of John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. And so the tale goes that Henry V was able to come into power through a hole in the Duke of Burgundy's skull, because the new Duke of Burgundy, the Duke I've already mentioned, Philip the Good, backs the English claim. And at the Treaty of Troyes, a new order is established whereby the son of King Henry V, by his new wife, Catherine de Valois, the daughter of the Mad King, shall become King of France and England legitimately for the first time. Henry V then spends the rest of his reign fighting for his future son's inheritance. But he dies prematurely. He dies at the siege of Mont Saint-Michel in 1422, just a few weeks before the Mad King would die, ensuring that he would never become regent of France in his own right. And so the cause of France is instead left to the Duke of Bedford, who very successfully is able to hold on to these English gains that you see in the north and begin proceeding to Orleans. The Dauphin Charles has escaped. The Duke of Burgundy is still allied with the English. And if Orleans is said to fall, then the English will essentially have nothing stopping them, because the great River Loire is the great natural barrier which is preventing the English from linking up their territories in the north with their territory of Gascony around Bordeaux to the south. Indeed, if you find maps of the earlier Hundred Years' War, these territories were actually more English in some ways than French, because these were part of the larger Duchy of Aquitaine. It's these territories that the English are holding in the north, which are actually more tentative in ways, with the exception of Brittany and Normandy, from a historical point of view, the regions of the Ile-de-France and the regions of the Champagne. And so it was very possible during the regency of Duke of Bedford for the young Henry VI that France could have fallen. And yet we have the, again, almost inexplicable entry of Joan the Maid into the events of France, her coming to the king at Chinon, and her being recognized as the leader of France's armies, and then her liberating the siege of Orleans, which was essentially seemed almost a doomed cause, within 5 days, leading to the coronation and the march on the city of Rheims, which legitimizes the cause of Charles VII. And this is the letter that Joan dictated to the English besiegers at Orleans, because I really want to understand again how you can reconcile a God-anointed cause to that of a partisan national cause. King of England and you, Duke of Bedford, who call yourself regent of the realm of France, William de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk, John, Lord of Talbot, and you, Thomas, Lord of Esquel, who call yourselves lieutenants of the said Duke of Bedford, do right by the King of Heaven to blood royal, yield to the Maid, who is sent of God, the King of Heaven, the keys of all the good towns you have taken and ravished in France. She has come hither by orders of the King of Heaven to redeem the blood royal. She is ready to make peace if you will do right by her and by France, to which you may do justice and repay what you have seized. And you, archers and barrack-room companions of war, of high birth or low, who stand before the good town of Orleans, be off in the name of God to your own country. King of England, if you will not do so, I am a leader in war, and in whatever place I may find your folk in France, I will turn them out willy-nilly, and who will not obey I shall kill, and who will obey I shall spare. Nor believe that you can hold all the realm of France. No, by God the Son of Mary, Charles the King will hold it, the right heir. For God, the King of heaven, wills it so, as the Maid has revealed to him. He will come at last into Paris with a goodly company. If you will not hearken to the words of God by the mouth of the Maid, in whatever place we find you, we will strike great swings and make such rough and tumble as not been raised in France this 1,000 years. Then shall we see which is better right from the God of heaven, we or you. Emphasis here on many things rather. The blood royal, Le Prince du Sang, the Prince of the Blood, because that's the whole basis of 14th century formulation of French Salic law, that the rightful King of France has to come from the male line and not just simply a male inheritor, as was the case of Edward III. So that is the bedrock of her claim for the legitimacy of the throne of France to belonging to the so-called King of France, or Charles Le Dauphin. But another aspect here, which is that if you listen to this and you listen to the extremity of it and the willingness to do war in every manner, it reminds me of the Spanish requirement, which was delivered during the early days of the conquistadors to various tribes in the Indies and Hispaniola. There is a myth that it was actually delivered to the Emperor of the Incas himself, but that hasn't really been attested to. And the emphasis of the Spanish requirement is to make the mother of the church, to make Mary your mistress, to take the bride of Christ as your mistress, that being the church, and to do homage to their Catholic majesties, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. Now, this doesn't sound too different from the Spanish requirement. However, the main difference between the Spanish requirement and this is that the Spanish requirement was delivered against heretics and heathens. So the fact that this is ostensibly delivered against the English, who are in good obedience to a church in Rome, would lend credence to, you can say, the admonitions and the mockery of the English and the immortal portrayal of her by Shakespeare as this political actor and this trumped-up harlot, effectively. And this in contrast to the demands that she makes here, for example, of the king of the Duke of Burgundy, that he return to his obedience, whereas the English have to leave France, or she will make war on them in whatever way she can. And indeed, emphasis also on 1,000 years of French history, that this is the God-granted realm since the consecration of France during the coronation of Clovis, which begins the whole mythical association with the anointing of the king at the Notre Dame de Reims. So how does one reconcile this? Well, there are intimations from her various trials that she views this as the end of a 100 years chastisement of France. And again, I look back to the various examples I brought up regarding the Tourdinel affair, Philip IV and his own notoriety, the fact that Philip IV was responsible for the dissolution of the Knights Templar, and indirectly he was responsible for the murder of a pope by his operative de Nogaret, this being Boniface VIII. And so the arrival of Joan would thereby be France again, as I've alluded to with the previous prophecies, that Joan would be delivering France from this 100 years chastisement of the kingdom for falling so afoul of the unity of the church and of the ways of God. And so when she takes command of the armies, Joan is insistent on emphasizing that it is a sacramental army, that the army of France must go into confession before battle, and that the soldiers under the banner of the king must take mass twice daily. And there's a wonderful little anecdote where she is talking with Lahier, who would later probably win the greatest French victory of all of the 100 Years' War, which is that of the Battle of Patay. Lahier, it should be mentioned, is a nom de guerre. It means the wrath of God, but his real name was Etienne de Vinaux. And she was discussing with Lahire, who was this grizzled old veteran of the wars of the Hundred Years' War, and she invites him to pray before God at the Siege of Orleans. And he makes this prayer: God, I pray thee that thou wouldst do this day for Lahire as much as thou wouldst that Lahire would do for thee if he was God and thou wast Lahire. And that has since been repeated in various forms and guises to represent the earnest prayer of the honest soldier. And it is from this, essentially, this whole act of consecration of the French army. It's not just her arrival, but it's the whole idea that Joan of Arc is rededicating the armies of France to a God-given purpose. And so how can I best summarize the response to this than by reading out Shakespeare again, Henry VI, part one, this being John Talbot, the famous Knight of England, and his assessment of the after effects of the Siege of Orleans. My thoughts are whirled like a potter's wheel. I know not where I am nor what I do. A witch by fear, not force, like Hannibal drives back our troops, conquers as she lists, so bees with smokes and doves with noisome stench are from their hives and houses driven away. They called us for our fierceness, English dogs. Now like the whelps we crying run away. Hark, countrymen, either renew the flight or tear the lions out of England's coat. Renounce your soil, give sheep in lions' stead. Sheep run not half so treacherous as the wolf or horse or oxen from the leopard, as you fly from your oft-subdued slaves. The oft-subdued slaves, of course, referencing the fact that the French had been so brought low by the English in the preceding decades. From Joan of Arc's point of view, her simple mission was to see France delivered and to see her king crowning the king in Reims. So from the Siege of Orleans, we go off and we have her intervention at the Battle of Jargeau, a Battle of Meung-sur-Loire, and the Battle of Beaugency in the year 1429. These are the battles to so-called secure the Loire, the towns to the back of Reims before the peaceful march on Reims, which allows for the coronation to take place. It's also very fortuitous for the King of France that the Archbishop of Reims himself is in the camp of the French king at Chinon. However, a lot of historical revisionism, which is designed again to exalt the military virtues of Joan of Arc, put emphasis on her victory at the Battle of Bataille. Indeed, in rereading Mark Twain's fictional account for this, the Battle of Bataille is very much the victory of Joan of Arc. It's the defeat of Fastolf and the capture of John Talbot. But this is not credited to Joan. It's credited to the legend of Joan of Arc, but in reality, Joan did not participate in this battle. These were forces led by Lahire. And the image on the right I've included very consciously because it's very inaccurate, despite the fact it's a contemporary image, because this was the battle where the French knight was able to completely annihilate the English longbowmen. There were only a couple of hundred French knights versus as many as 5,000 English regulars alongside longbowmen, but the French were able to utterly annihilate them at the Battle of Bataille. So this was in many ways for the French the vengeance against the Battle of Agincourt. And then for the course of the military career of Joan of Arc, she insists that the king march on Paris. He does not. We'll get into the various reasons as to why that is later. And instead, she wages her own almost private war, resulting in the siege of Compiègne. And that leads to her capture, even though the siege is ultimately successful. So moreover, how can we understand this blatant partisanship for Joan of Arc over the cause of France? Well, I come back to the idea of injustice and illegality of the treaty that created these events. There is a legend associated that once the Treaty of Troyes was signed between Henry V and King Charles VI, the Mad King, that the black flag was flown and brought to her village of Domremy, again contrasting the black flag which was associated with the Treaty of Troyes, which brought the English to rule over France, and the white flag, which is the banner of Joan of Arc, as if history is trying to right itself in that way from the point of view of the de Valois cause. And again, the story then goes on that Charles VII will become convinced of his own legitimacy via the intercession of Joan. You can look to more mundane aspects of this, which is that bring up the map here on the extreme right, the village of Domremy and Vaucouleurs were almost unique around that time in the 1420s, in the sense that they were both anti-Burgundian and anti-English. The governor of Vaucouleurs was basically a tiny island of France, of the cause of de Valois in the east of France. And if anything, you can say that made the friction between the villages of Domremy and Vaucouleurs all the more piquant, and the juxtaposition all the more extreme, of the fact that this is a village which is surrounded on all sides by the enemy. And again, the fact that it is so anti-Burgundian at the same time. The Burgundians sacked the village and famously murdered a incarcerated madman who Joan had been able to befriend in the years following up to her leaving Vaucouleurs on her mission towards Chinon. We then have instances of, during the trial of Joan of Arc, where Saint Catherine and Saint Margaret are almost presented by Joan of Arc as being partisans for the French cause, by the intimation that the cross-examiners at Rouen believed that the angels were never deemed to speak English, and that Catherine and Margaret could speak French better than anyone. Of course, once she was cross-examined on that, she did not hold to that, but such intimations were clear as to try and understand why this partisanship towards France would be seen as sacrilegious, that she's elevating patriotism to the cause of a holy mission. But again, this is a whole part of her political project as well. I've mentioned her military and her religious entry into the world stage, but she was very important for reconciling various allies of the king. So, for example, the most senior general in France is the Constable of France. At this time, it was a Breton, one Arthur de Richemont, and he was the archenemy of Georges de la Troimoille, who was the Grand Chamberlain, the main advisor of the Dauphin Charles. And it's through the intercession of Joan of Arc that Arthur de Richemont is able to become reconciled once again to the cause of the king, albeit it'll take several decades, and it will take the death of Joan of Arc to fully cement. So how can you look at this and say, was France really deserving? And I want to go back to Mark Twain on this, because even though, again, it's a fictional account, he has a wonderful way with words. His book on Joan of Arc was described by himself as his greatest novel, even though it's probably the least known. The fame of the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn have more than outshone it. But nevertheless, he's able to perfectly capture, in my view, the pusillanimous state of France, and how, if Joan was to represent a divine intervention into profane history, how France was not worthy of that intervention. Following the capture of Joan, at bottom, the French were still under the spell of timorousness born of generations of unsuccess and a lack of confidence in each other and in their leaders, born of old and bitter experiences in the way of treacheries of all sorts. For their kings had been treacherous to their great vassals and to their generals, and these in turn were treacherous to the head of state and to each other. The soldiery found they could depend utterly on Joan and on her alone. With her gone, everything was gone. She was the sun that melted the frozen torrents and set them boiling. With the sun removed, they froze again, and the army of all France became what they had been before, mere dead corpses. That and nothing more, incapable of thought, hope, ambition, or motion. The personal reflections, as I mentioned, they are contrived as a translation from a confidant of Joan's, and the impression from this really is that Joan's influence was yet to be felt. And this alludes to another prophecy of Joan of Arc's, that unless her military advice was heeded, and that Paris be taken immediately after the fall of Rheims, that it would take 20 years and not 6 months to remove the English. France was reclaimed nonetheless, but it turns out that her prophecy was correct. It did take 20 years for France to be unified under the cause of the Valois, for the English to be ejected completely. In the case of, you can see at the extreme left on this image here, which is the Battle of Castillon, led by the same John Talbot that I've been alluding to, interestingly enough. And this, I would say, leads to my very cynical reading as to why Joan could be captured and as to why her ransom was paid to the Burgundians by the English and not the French. Why would France be so pusillanimous? Why would France fail to pay Joan's ransom or make any serious effort to liberate her from Rouen? Well, this is because her usefulness had expired. The king had no need anymore of divine intervention because it had already won him the crown, and in the long term, a aspect of the divine could prove more liability to both the king and his ministers, in particular l'être royal. And so far better that a English kangaroo court declare Joan a heretic than Joan herself call out the king as a traitor to France. The divine, essentially, in my view, had worked its wonders. Now, history, profane history, could resume its course. And if you look at Charles VII, and definitely his son, Louis XI, who was known essentially to French posterity as the universal spider, these kings, of which Joan attached herself to their cause so passionately, were the furthest things away from, say, her predecessor, Saint Louis. So are there any contemporary examples of Joan of Arc? I believe the closest thing that we have to a contemporary example of Joan of Arc is actually Jan Hus, the famous Bohemian ultraquist heretic, who died in the year 1415 when Joan of Arc was only 3. Because Jan Hus is seen as an antecedent to Protestantism, especially with the course of the Habsburgs restoring their control over Bohemia. And he is seen today, he's been recast like Joan of Arc has, as a secular hero for Czech nationalism. And the interesting thing is that there is a lot of intimation regarding the literature around Joan and her role in prophecy, is that Joan was far more than the French cause, has actually already been alluded to, and I've used quotes by Mark Twain to really establish that Joan's cause seemed to be greater than that of France, and that Joan had an anticipated mission for all of Christendom. And the implication would be that it would be against the Hussites. It would be to concrete the unification of the church under, this would be Martin V, and the new sort of stabilized Roman pontiffs after the end of the Greater Western Schism, but also against the heresies as well, most notably the Hussites, the Hussite heresy in Bohemia that would linger on for generations after Joan's death. So that's the patriotic cause, but I think I've already sort of hinted enough that I believe that it's far more important, and I think it's far better to read Joan of Arc and her cause as a cause for royal legitimacy, more so than the cause of France as a nation. Indeed, if you're going to look at Joan of Arc and disassociate her from the monarchy, I very much feel that you're reading presentist national French objectives and maybe even Anglophobic readings into Joan of Arc as well, because something that should astonish everyone here is that Joan of Arc is worshipped as a saint not only by Catholics but also by Anglicans as well. And so it's far, again, more consistent with everything that I've been stating regarding Joan and the role of Greater Christendom and the whole notion of sacramental kingship and the virtues of the coronation and her hearkening back to Clovis and the 1,000 years of France existing as a nation, that it comes back to this idea that she is restoring right monarchy to France, and that the cause of the English be unjust by virtue of that. And this is a segment from Hilaire Belloc's history of Joan of Arc. The Duke of Alençon heard the Maid speak openly of things of France. This is her at Chinon. How the kingdom was held in fealty from God alone, of whom Charles was vassal and underlord, as had all his fathers been before him. For so they had stood since that day when Robert the Strong, whose father's birthplace and lineage no man knew, had held France against the heathen far back in the night of years. From him all the kings were descended, and the crown Capetian which was the centre and prop of the world and the eye of Christendom, now in such heavy peril. Let Charles, she said, surrender his fief, the great realm to God, and receive it again in vassalage, to hold for the King of Heaven, and let him keep to right living in mercy, pardon prisoners, be good to the lowly, and great and even to his enemies. The emphasis that France is the pillar of Christendom in this sense, that they owe their lineage all the way back to the Robertians, who are the antecedents of the Capetians who come to the French monarchy in the year 987, if I recall. And that the cause of the Hundred Years' War has been a stain on greater Christendom. But more so, it's simply not a matter that Charles is the right king because he has the right bloodline. But more so, he needs to reconsecrate his kingdom. He needs to surrender his kingdom to God, and he needs to receive it again. So Joan is not simply crowning the king as he already is, essentially. Joan never calls him the king before the coronation. She always refers to him as the Dauphin. When she believes essentially that she is standing there, you can see in the image of contemporary images on the left of a far more subdued Joan and a modern image of a far more prominent Joan, again emphasizing the meta role of her connotations towards sainthood, is that she is reconsecrating the kingdom of France back to God. Indeed, it's fascinating sort of looking more into the implications of this, because during her interactions with her trialers at Poitiers, this is the far less known trial because we have no records of it. They were mysteriously destroyed, but we do have other sources which attest to this. Specifically, her interaction with a Dominican theologian, William Segun, and we know during this interaction that Joan gives a very famous response concerning the voices that she heard from the saints and the angels, that they spoke French better than he did. But there was a far more significant response that came from this broader conversation with the intercession of Jacques Jaloux, who already mentioned at the beginning, the Archbishop of Embrun, regarding the nature of her mission and the role of her sex. Why is it so important that a woman deliver France, and why is it so important that a woman assume this military role? And this is the response. If God so desires, by Jaloux, if God so desires, he can vanquish by the power of a woman. Doing so confounds human presumption. The pride of those who put their confidence in themselves is brought down, and he chooses the weak to confound the strong. This is not only a allusion to the fact that she is a woman, that she has put herself again in the weakest role of the fairer sex to confound the English dogs, of which they themselves refer to as affectionately. But there is an explicit implication here, which was felt at the time, that she was the new David to England's Goliath. The tale of David and Goliath and the God-forsaken reign of Saul in the book of Samuel, the idea that Saul is the false king of Israel and that God will rededicate Israel to God through the consecration of the kingdom of Daniel. Again, deliver France, the new kingdom. There was a Carolingian association during the reign of Charlemagne to David, to King David as France, the pillar of Christendom. All of these things were whirling around in the medieval imagination at the time. And they're also, again, attested to the fact that David came from rather humble origins, like Joan's peasant status, and the fact that David became beloved of the armies of King Saul. And Saul eventually conspired against David. The ironic thing is that that actually happens with Charles VII, but I've already said as to why Charles VII and her being abandoned at Rouen represents a sort of return to the era of profane history as opposed to the divine element in history. So this association with her and David slaying Goliath was made explicit at that time. So now we need to come to the final thing, which is the confirmation of Charles's legitimacy, because again, part of the legend of Joan of Arc is that it's through her intercession that Charles begins to believe in himself. And why would that be the case? Coming back to Hilaire Belloc, the common people of the countryside had in them indeed a memory of the crown of the lilies, the heart of Christendom from the days of their fathers' fathers, from the days of the first faith grew among their hearts, but no man moved. So things stood when the old mad king, Charles VI, being now dead, the 6 years gone, 1428, and the Dauphin, 25 years old, Bedford moved to the final throw. He would take Orleans upon the Loire, the fortress which forbade the passage of the river, and after he had taken Orleans, he would cross the stream and hold the south, and so at last all of France. In the summer, he raised forces in England with many guns, great and small. In the autumn, he drew his lines around Orleans. It was October, in the year of our Lord 1428. Shut in his closet alone, the Dauphin despaired. A doubt took him whether such misfortunes were not proof that the tale was true, and he none of the king's blood. He prayed there, apart, a strong particular prayer, well remembered, deeply graven into his heart. In this prayer he prayed that if indeed he were not of the blood royal, but a bastard, born as his base mother had proclaimed, then let God remove from his heart the desire for sovereignty, but at least not to let him be killed or captured, but escape to safeguard in the court of Castile or of Scotland, friends from the old with the lilies. The cause of Castile had a recent fracas with the Lancasterians under John of Gaunt, and by the friendship with Scotland, he is of course referring to the old alliance between Scotland and France. Even if the cause of the King of France be completely and utterly hopeless, it would still be useful for the Scots to support him, because it meant undermining the English in the process. And so the Dauphin besought God, if indeed he were the Dauphin of the great line, to grant him a sign. But how could it be given a sign? So he prayed, and he told no man living of that prayer. And so Joan arrives at Chinon. Joan and her companions went up into the castle. She was taken through the stone passage to the great wall which stands by the southern wall overlooking the tower. And so suddenly, into the great hall, she dressed in her man's clothes, in grey hose and tunic, but with the black jacket over, tall, and her dark hair cut round at the neck, as a man's would be. That high room was filled very full with all the people of the court, all splendid, each in the robes of his order, and the jewels and gold of their estates, and the colours of their silks and velvets, and there was light from 50 cresset hanging from the walls. In that hall were Renaud of Chartres, Archbishop of Rheims, and primate of the realm, that being the highest priest of the realm, and that huge-bellied man, L'Étremeau, very rich, intriguing, who had the most power with the hesitating king, and Gaucourt, who speaks of that day, and a crowd besides, 300 in all, and talk and moving till she came. But half a week away lay Orleans, besieged, with the English works around it. Even that day had reinforcements for them come in from the north, and their cannon was speaking. There did she long to be. It was Louis de Bourbon, Count of Vendôme, of the blood royal. He also came from the line of St. Louis, who led Joan in. Nor was she abashed nor forward, but simple and straight in her carriage. But they who had heard how she had said that she would know the king by divine power, said to her, pointing as she passed, Look, there is the king, and showed her another, or again, Look, he is there. For the king, to try her, had taken care to put no mark or rank, or to stand apart, or receive deference, but was dressed as any other might have been, and mixed in with the rest of the crowd. But she went straight up to him, as to mark him, without halt or turning, and knelt before him, and said, looking upon his face, God give you long life, noble king. Charles said to her, I am not the king. She answered, In God's name, sir, you are the king, and no other. Give me troops wherewith to succour Orleans, and to guard you in Rheims, to be anointed and crowned, for it is the will of God. And so all of this again is to emphasize it's almost a pageantry, it's almost too good to be true, that if the king is so concerned over the cause of his bastardy, and this is a political matter, this isn't a personal matter simply for the king, all of France is concerned with the nature of his bastardy, because if his bastardy hold true, then the cause of Henry VI from the Duke of Bedford is completely legitimate, and the Treaty of Troyes was also legitimate. You can maybe make a claim that another prince of the blood, like the Bourbon, the Count of Vendôme, had a better claim than the English, but nevertheless, that would have almost been to complicate matters even further. And so it is a great process that results in the legitimation of Charles. It allows him to come to this moment of personal fruition where he is crowned. So moving on from with Belloc, Charles did take her apart somewhat and talk to her privately, seeing that she was known to him. But what they said together we are not told. Yet whether it were then or a little later, this we know, that the sign whereby the king should know she was from God was given, and his mind was changed. For what Joan said was this: she told him of the time when he, Charles of Valois, Dauphin of France and true king of the blood royal, had in a memorable day withdrawn from all other men and prayed a special prayer in his oratory, quite alone, doubting his own lineage and his right. If indeed he were not of the blood royal, but a bastard born of his base mother, which had been proclaimed, then let God remove from his heart the desire for sovereignty, but at least let him not be killed or captured, but escape to safeguard in the court of friends from old with the lilies. This again emphasizes a lot of things regarding the whole sort of, you can say again, confirmation of legitimate monarchy from the point of view of, again, the propaganda mill that is going into Charles VII. Joan here is encapsulating peasant wisdom, that the peasant knows the king. The peasant is not infatuated with intrigues or factions. They have a base, but you can say therefore more authentic understanding of the way the world should be. There is a king of France and he is in Paris. There is a pope in Rome and there is no other pope than the pope in Rome. And so for Joan, without her education, without her being part of a political faction, albeit she was effectively forced to be by the intrigues of La Tremoille and the intrigues again of the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, that it is this peasant from the land confirming the king in his authority, that the peasant would also again know that the coronation is what makes the king, this return to Clovis and Charlemagne, and not simply the fact that he is king because his ostensibly legitimate father was the king before him. That is all these sacramental elements that make a king. And so he must be made king for the eyes of the peasants and not just for the eyes of his partisan nobility, which are surrounding him at Chinon. And indeed, the confirmation of all of this is that Joan knows the king, despite the intentional trick that was played on her. And indeed, the trick being played on her would have been very useful for the likes of La Tremoille, and it was. On her route from Domremy to Chinon, she was harassed many times. There were many attempts to kill her for that obvious reason. There was no desire among many prelates of the church, including the Archbishop of Reims, it should be noted, to see this mad peasant girl who was receiving visions, potentially from Satan, to bewitch the king and further trammel on the cause of France. Imagine this. Imagine a mad peasant harlot comes to the cause of a king who is already basically at his lowest ebb. This could ruin the cause of the monarchy. The fact that a peasant girl has been given this position of righteous authority among their armies. And it's only essentially, you can say, by the surreal and the great entering into history, other than simply looking at this from the matter of profane history, that history is able to turn so completely and so decisively in the favor of the Dauphin's cause. Hence, again, the necessity of the concentration on the Orleans campaign, the coronation of coronation at Reims, to transfigure the Dauphin into the king, and by extension, delegitimating Bedford and Henry VI. And Bedford understands this. Regent Bedford understands that he now needs to crown the infant king, Henry VI, as soon as possible. So he is taken to the Notre Dame de Paris and he is made king there. But Reims is the coronation cathedral. And so even though he is now crowned King of France, Henry VI, it is not the same. The act has already been undertaken. The English did not dedicate the resources needed to prevent the coronation there. And you can say their belated response is indeed a belated response. It's too little, too late. So this is the final motivation of Joan's campaign, the transition from illegitimate coward into fighting sovereign. And in terms, again, I've labeled this discussion Joan, the Maid, and the Meta. This has major implications going forward for French legitimism and French monarchism in general. If we are to believe all of these things associated with the cause of Joan of Arc, that she is there to buttress the pillar of France and reconsecrate the cause of France to the will of God, if we are going to see a new Davidian kingdom brought about on earth, and this is David slaying Goliath, then why shouldn't the French kings feel a bit puffed up as a result of this association? Why shouldn't they feel that they are exalted among all of the other European sovereigns? And indeed, that was exactly the extent of this. During the reign of Louis XI, who was also able to defeat the Duke of Burgundy and bring back most of those lands into the throne of France again for the first time in 150 years, we see the beginning really of French Gallicanism, which is going to be confirmed under his successor, King Francis. And by Gallicanism, this is the idea that the French king has the right to appoint bishops in France, that the church in France is in many ways set above as a national church over all of the other Catholic churches within Christendom. And similar to what we see with the investiture controversy in the Holy Roman Empire, a similar situation where the emperor appoints and the pope confirms. And in the case of Gallicanism, this would essentially be elevating the King of France to that of the Holy Roman Emperor. And it should be therefore no surprise to us also if you see this, I hope I have it demonstrated, yes, this banner on the right, and this banner perhaps even sort of more brilliantly expressed with Lynch's painting on the left, that the banner of Joan of Arc, she's also now known as Joan de Lis. Joan of the Lily is the Bourbon flag. It is the white flag. It is the flag of purity and divinity because she is the Maid of France. So at a time, again, during the 16th century, during the wars of religion, where it seems that Catholicism is in its death throes and that the monarchy of France is going to collapse, that there's going to be civil war, that the Spanish are going to partition the rest of France and among the various sort of great nobles and Protestant Calvinist lords, that once Henry IV comes in and once we see the reign of Louis XIV, and again, all of those grand associations of France being the greatest kingdom par excellence in Europe, that we should intimately associate ourselves with the white flag, because the white flag, of course, is the flag of Joan of Arc. The implication here is explicit. And indeed, this goes back to a further conversation I did a while ago regarding Henry V, the King of France who never was, and the white flag controversy, or derisively known as the white napkin, when in 1873 there was the possibility of the restoration of the monarchy of France after the Franco-Prussian War and the beginning of the French Third Republic. However, he refused because he would not accept the tricolour as the flag of France. He had to accept the French white flag as the throne of France. And if you're intimately associated with the implications of the white flag based on everything that I've been saying here, you can perfectly understand why a legitimate French sovereign would want to associate his mission with the flag of Joan of Arc, because it is the flag of legitimism. It is the flag of right monarchy overcoming all of the corrupting symbols of intellectual, sort of political and ideological perversion that come out of this. And so, at the end of this, the failure of France to adopt the white flag really is the end of the cause of legitimism and monarchy in France at this time. And I'm not inventing these associations. The year 1869 was the year where proceedings began for Joan of Arc's canonization. And the early 1870s, and indeed much of the Second Empire period, was also a great period of Catholic restoration in France. So all of these associations were rather explicit within the 1870s at a time of the white flag controversy. So therefore, another time where the monarchy of France is challenged and it loses the fight, and so the white flag goes with her. But now I want to go to Belloc and the other sort of symbolic associations with Joan of Arc beyond simply the white flag. She had a great horse given her, Joan of Arc, to carry her, all from the king. And there also she had made by her command a standard by which she might be known in battle. For in those days commanders needed such things, since with visors lowered, they could not be known by their followers, save by their flags. But this standard of hers was from her sisters of paradise, for it was St. Catherine and St. Margaret who had told her in the voices which wrapped her of what sort it should be. It was to be of fine white linen, with the lilies of the realm scattered on it and sewn. And there was to be painted on it the figure of our Lord, with the world in his hand, and on either side 2 angels adoring with the motto, Jesus, Mary. And so was it made on its long staff for her to hold. As for the blazon on her shield, which was blue, It was a white dove, having a scroll in its beak, and written on the scroll were the words, "By command of the King of Heaven." It should also be known, rather coincidentally, that the blue shield with the dove was actually the chosen symbol of Richard II of England, and for similar reasons, it should also be noted. If you watch my conversation on Richard II, the king would have given her also a sword, new as the armor was, but she had design never to slay or wound of her own hand in battle, and would not have this sword. But since one at arms must have some sword, this was given to her, a sword of power, and it was her, kin from paradise, who found it for her, that she might again be given a sign. For she had a letter written in the priests of the shrine of St. Catherine of Fierbois, the day's ride beyond Chinon, that same at which she had prayed and heard 3 masses in the time she was first riding to the king. There, by the altar, they should dig, and they would find buried in earth and not deep an old sword of power, and that they might know by what authority. She spoke, she told them, that when they found this sword, they would see graven upon it 5 crosses. But she did not see the man whom they sent with this message. So they dug behind the altar of that shrine, as she had commanded, and found that old sword buried there in the earth, but not deeply, and the 5 crosses were on it, as she had said, but it was rusted. They burnished it, therefore, till it shone, and sent it back to her at Tours. And the people of Tours, glorifying in this new sign, gave her 2 sheaths for the sword, one of velvet for daily wearing, and one in cloth of gold for great days. But she had a strong sheath of leather made for this sword, and kept it therein at her side whenever she rode in arms. Yet though it was often in her hand, it was never drawn in blood, nor even struck a blow, save once, when with the flat of it she drove before a loose woman of the camp, a prostitute, but was for her a signal of command, with which in her right hand, and the staff of her banner in her left, and planted, she would stand in the heat of battle, and crying "Hardee" to her own, to be wounded, but not to wound. We'll get into whether that sincerity was really kept. But this is where most of the accusations against her of idolatry come into play. Over the accusations that this armor and the sword of Joan had been elevated intentionally, not necessarily again by Joan herself, but definitely around the myth makers surrounding her, to sanctify her visions and to give her cause essentially the air of legitimation for that of the Dauphin Charles. She had a very poignant and I would say beautiful response to this with her trialers at Rouen. If it had borne the burden, it had earned the honor, not worship, but a simple recognition. The legend then has it that of the relics of Joan, after her burning at the stake, that her ashes were bidden to the Seine, lest they be worshipped, and that only her heart survived. If you're going to look at the origin of the etymology of angel, angel and fire have one meaning, and the heart as the fire that never dies. And of course, the explicit association with Joan of Arc is at the heart of Joan, the heart of France, the Immaculate Heart, the heart of the Maid of France. And so it should come to no surprise that these relics were sought after and intentionally destroyed during the French Revolution, to the extent that we do not have anything left that was touched by Joan of Arc. Everything was deliberately destroyed, because of course it would be, because the cause of the French Revolution after 1792 was a cause against monarchy in France. Monarchy was the scion of reactionary superstition, torture, cruel and unusual punishment. The ancien regime had to be completely delegitimated. And so, whilst the French Revolution is in many ways the cause of modern French nationalism, it was also virulently anti-Joan of Arc. And of course, the irony here, in my referencing the discovery of her sword, what is another illusion, explicit illusion that we see? If we're going to look at Merlin's prophecies, Joan of Arc has found her own Excalibur, and with her Excalibur, she is going to restore the kingdom of France to be that of the kingdom of David against Goliath. So all of these associations, these Arthurian associations, mythic associations, these prophecies, all are wedded, you can say cynically, or as a result of something else beyond that of profane history, concreted in the form of Joan of Arc. And therefore, we can say that Joan of Arc was essential towards the religious rekindling of the restoration of France following the Revolution. That we shouldn't be surprised that during the 19th century, the image of France as Joan of Arc is worshipped, but more so as we see the separation of church of state in 1905 and the secular French Third Republic born in the 1890s and early 1900s, that the cause for the canonization of Joan of Arc for the French right becomes all the more pertinent. But that is a discussion I want to really leave for another conversation, because as you can probably tell, my voice is struggling a bit. So there's no way I'm going to be able to do all of the modern implications of Joan of Arc in one lecture. So I'm going to leave it with just focusing on the contemporary aspects of Joan of Arc. Going back to Deborah Fraioli and the literary images of Joan of Arc, the image of Joan of Arc in literature was subject to the influence of another kind of writing, a nascent genre in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, French patriotic literature. Although not prophetic literature, properly speaking, we've already alluded to what we mean by prophecy with Merlin in particular. This poetry adopts a prophetic tone to present its ideas, and the line of argument is based in large part on medieval prophecy. Written before Joan of Arc's arrival on the historical scene, the poetry contains the elements of a programme to restore the monarchy, a programme remarkably similar to Joan's mission as she would later profess it. Furthermore, since the 12th century, the miracles de Notre Dame, in this case, Our Lady would actually mean Joan the Maid, which you can also say from the point of view of the English is definitely a moment of idolatry, had identified the Virgin as a source of aid and an agent of divine intervention. The idea of aid coming from a woman already had contemporary plausibility. Although many poets express the ideas to be described here, most typical are Eustache Deschamps, Robert Blondel, and Charles d'Orléans. French patriotic poetry emphasized that the French had been favored by God as his elect. The evidence lay in the glory of France's early rulers, especially of Clovis and of Charlemagne, but also in the belief, arrived at through the legitimization of legends, that the symbols of the monarchy, the fleur de lis, the cris de guerre, the cause of war, and especially the coronation ceremony, were of divine origin. Accompanying the idea of the French as God's elect was the disturbing notion, supported by the prophecies of the Sibyls and by Saint Bridget of Sweden, that France would experience a period of tribulation for her sins. I've already gone into that extensively. It was understood that if these sins, mortal sins of sloth, cowardice, and luxury, as well as the sin of the divided France, were not corrected, they would ultimately result in the loss of war and the destruction of the kingdom. The imagery used to convey the pitiable state of the kingdom was trampled, the trampled lily. Hope lay in the image of the regrowth of the lily. But and again, I hate to say this, but she uses the word Judeo-Christian, so I'm simply going to omit the Judeo from that. In Christian thought, the notion of sin is accompanied by the notion of redemption, and the patriotic poets gave a redemption a political interpretation. They promised that the recovery of France, that redemption from sin, was attainable. And the reason I'm exercising that is, again, the association that Saint Louis was known for many things, including his burning of the Talmud. So it would seem completely incongruous to a mindset of that age to use such a notion as Judeo-Christian. The way to political recovery was through a revival of the God-given symbols of the monarchy, through action and through prayer. The Virgin Mary figures prominently in the patriotic poems as the agents of redemption, much as Joan of Arc would figure as the agent of recovery. Finally, there is the promise of peace and tranquility, resembling the promises of the Sibyls and the Book of Daniel. The Book of Daniel, of course, being one of the greatest books of prophecy in the Bible, which I've actually gone into extensively. It remains to be demonstrated that the images and expectations of the patriotic poets were, in fact, used in contemporary literature about Joan of Arc. But one should answer the potential objection that the programs outlined above was not a program at all, but rather independent musings of isolated poets despondent about deterioration caused by war. There is substantial evidence to the contrary. It is perhaps enough to note that several authors reveal the intent to serve their country through their poetry. Their poems were meant to be a call to arms. Nowhere is this more evident than in Robinet's introduction to his French translation of Robert Blondel's Complanctus. Speaking to France, Robinet declares, Car les acteurs, et j'ai aussi, étant latin, étant ceci, par subjecter, aimant tes savants, tout les aimerait quevant, désirant dans Dieu et taisément, ton secteur et tout baissant, et sévère de que volontaire, si milieu savions dire ou faire, which, roughly for me to translate, we employ use of our language, Latin, and our love to serve you, with such weapons that we have, desiring of which goods and witnesses to help you in all your needs, and to serve with a willing heart, if only we knew better how to speak or how to act on your behalf. In two pieces of literature, written during the Maid's lifetime, serve to show the influences of the themes, tone, and programme of these patriotic writers. In both works, Joan of Arc is shown to be the answer to France's needs, the fulfilment of the prophecies. The first of these works is the prophecy, O insigne lilium, the sign of the lily, apparently transcribed only once in the Recollections by Jean Bréal. It is of a virtually unknown origin. Bréal himself ascribes it to a Hungarian princess named Engelide, who has not been further identified, though the prophecy shows the influence of Celtic legends and a second Charlemagne prophecy. It was important here is that it resembles the work of these patriotic poets. All essential themes of patriotic poetry are found in the sign of the lily, the legitimacy of the monarchy, its deplorable present state, the aid to be bestowed on it through a virgin, and the peace that will result. The association, of course, in all of these is that the restorer from Mary is, of course, Joan of Arc. But now we have to come to the sort of contrasting image, which is the reality of war. The maid, the virgin, the purity associated with the virginity, and the soldier. Because there is an argument to be made, especially if you look at the retrial of Joan of Arc in 1456 and the testaments we have from those who are still alive, that Joan was a military genius. You could almost say that she was a 15th century Napoleon, albeit a Napoleon without any education, and a woman to boot, and significantly younger than Napoleon, even at his first major command at Toulon. So, just to give an example of here, because Joan's military genius was based on decisive action and action now, action to be brought upon the enemy as swiftly and decisively as possible against the cautious and you can almost say defeated mentality of the very able French commanders. Indeed, one of the main aspects of Joan of Arc, and indeed many of her village folk in Domremy, is the idea that these were the great captains of France. You know, we would be humbled to stand in their presence because they are doing the bidding of the rightful king. But in the actual company of these great military men, Joan of Arc was shown to have a very, very short temper and to impose her will, her personality. If you're going to, again, use a more secular assertion of this, her charismatic personality on the great commanders of France. So say, for example, take Joan of Arc's admonition of the Comte du Noir following a dispute over strategy during the siege of Orleans. In God's name, the counsel of our Lord is wiser and safer than yours. You have thought to deceive me. This is when he was going to continue the siege rather than rush and defeat the besiegers and take the English encircling towers to maintain the siege of Orleans. But it is you who are deceived. I bring you better help than has ever come to any general or any town, for the help I bring comes from the King of Heaven. And this is only sort of further substantiated. I mentioned the retrial. Well, these again are the recollections of the then Pope Pius II at her retrial regarding her military capabilities. The Maid led out her troops, and as soon as she saw the enemy with loud shouts and terrific force, she charged the English lines. Not a man dared to stand fast or show his face. Sudden panic and horror seized them all. There, drawn swords fell from their hands. Everyone threw away shield and helmet to be unencumbered for flight. Talbot's shouts of encouragement were unheard, and his threats unheeded. It was a most shameful rout. They presented only their backs to the Maid. The reports of these things carried to the neighbouring peoples, and by them to those farther off, and always increasing as it travelled, filled all with amazement. Indeed, the account here of the secret memoirs of a pope actually buttress Shakespeare's interpretation of John Talbot, but should also be mentioned again against this idea of pure military genius is another association that you can bring between Joan of Arc and Napoleon, is that Napoleon was said to be worth 50,000 men on the field of battle, and Joan of Arc was given that same epithet, that her presence was worth an army the size of thousands of men. And indeed, it's due to this mythic association with Joan being the divine avenger and the cause of the enemy being so just that would substantiate the flight of the English in this instance. But it's all the more remarkable that you can actually draw comparisons between Joan of Arc and Napoleon, but there you are. It's not out of the realm of possibility. This is an article by Larissa Juliet Taylor, Joan of Arc and the Church, and this in particular, how one can reconcile her military mission with her divine mission. Joan's motivation may have been divine, but on the battlefield she showed herself eager to fight. Although she claimed to hate bloodshed, her actions caused both English and French blood to flow. After taking the town of Jajo, which I already mentioned on the road to Rheims, the village was plundered and a massacre followed. The contention against this is that she deliberately intervened whenever she had the chance to lessen the punishment of the English, but nevertheless, we're still talking about the rules of war that would have been accustomed to in the 15th century. Although local militiamen may have carried out the carnage after Joan and the other leaders returned to Orleans, she bore at least partial responsibility for the outcome, and I believe that's true. And that's the problem. An admittedly hostile source, the bourgeoisie of Paris, states that she motivated her men to attack Paris on the feast of the Nativity by promising that she would take the city and each soldier would become rich from the city's goods, and they would put everyone to the sword and burn down all the houses where they met with any opposition. Now, you can again say that and say that this is actually inspired by the horror of Joan of Arc wanting to attack Paris so quickly after the successful capture of Rheims, and that it would have been very conducive towards the English to stir up such anti-Joan propaganda and the idea that she was a witch leading the armies of France to solidify the opposition of the Parisian population to the cause of now King Charles VII. Could she have said this? It is not impossible, considering what she wrote in her famous letter to the English, which I've already read. In it, she told the English leadership that they did not leave France. Wherever I find your people in France, I will make them leave, whether they want to or not, and if they do not obey, I will have them all killed. Joan was so incensed when the king called off the siege of Paris after 2 days that the king's chronicler and orders reported that she broke the blade of her famous sword of St. Catherine when she attacked some camp followers. Again, this puts against the accounts that we have of Belloc. An irate king told her that she should have used her baton rather than her special sword. When her trial judges asked her whether it was right to attack Paris on the Feast of Nativity, she replied flippantly that it is good to observe the feasts of Our Lady from beginning to end. She expressed no regrets, although much blood was spilled, especially on the French side. The failure on September 8, 1430, unavoidable without treason from within, marked the beginning of the end. Despite successive victories that cleared the English from the Loire, in large part due to Joan's unaccustomed tactics, that's what I mean by military genius, Charles lagged behind on a route to his coronation, as he and his councillors debated whether they should bypass Troyes or besiege it. Troyes is significant in the sense that it was the treaty town, and so taking it would have a symbolic indictment against the English cause. Joan interrupted their discussion. She told Charles, order your troops to besiege the city of Troyes without these endless deliberations. In the name of God, before 3 days have passed, I will have you enter the city either by love or by force. And again, Joan being accustomed to the image of the black flag carrying the dark words from the Treaty of Troyes, that the cause of France basically had been surrendered to the English. You can understand again from the quote-unquote peasant wisdom why there would be such an association with having to defeat the city of Troyes in the hands of the English. And again, this is a constant admonition you see in Joan's writings, her despairing at war councils that these deliberations amount to nothing, they have to be swept aside and action needs to prevail. And worse, if these war councils ultimately devolve into politicking and ultimately treason. Joan entered the trenches to fill them with branches and straw as she and her men prepared for the attack. But within 3 days, the city's bishop, speaking for the citizens, negotiated its capitulation. The coronation of Reims in July of 1429, when Joan stood next to Charles in military garb, proved the high point of her career. After that, she demonstrated both a sense of invincibility and an increased sense of pride as she wore knightly clothing and accepted costly gifts. And again, if you are going to take that word by word and say that this is the summit of her career, this is a personal zenith, and that this is a imbuing sense of pride, then by extension, the accusations that were on would be true, that she is intending to have herself venerated in some way or another, not necessarily worshipped, and that this will be a cause for her sake and not for God's sake. The major admonition against this is that the King Charles VII lavished praise, he lavished rewards, he lavished titles, he lavished lands on Joan of Arc, but she asked for none of these things. Indeed, she only asked for one thing, ostensibly. Joan of Arc asked for the one thing that had come as a result of the English occupation of much of northern France that was going to be imposed on her own village of Domremy, that Domremy be spared from taxation, and that this exemption should carry on in perpetuity. And indeed, that is the one thing that she was able to accomplish, and the one thing that did continue. And rather appropriately, the exemption for taxes of Domremy continued up until the French Revolution, when all elements of her legacy were put to the sword. So again, it's the notion of being prideful, or essentially simply having resulted in the victory, rather than, again, being imbued with a sense of pride and having accepted costly gifts, as opposed to having asked for said gifts. When the king, his councillors, and even Yolande of Aragon pursued truces with Burgundy, Joan took it upon herself to write to cities that had surrendered to the French but were not endangered. In August of 1430, she wrote to the citizens of Reims, "I am not at all content with these truces like these, but I don't know if I will hold to them. If I do so, I will only be in order to protect the king's honor. They will not abuse the blood royal, because I will not hold and maintain the army of the king together." Despite her skills in the battlefield and during the examinations of her trial, Jane came close to committing treason during the winter of 1430 because of her willingness. French victories had caused serious problems for John, Duke of Bedford and Regent of France. Desertions and problems obtaining reinforcements forced him to issue stern warnings, and Ron and Chronicler insisted that the renown of Joan the Maid had greatly altered the weakening English courage. Hostile Burgundian chroniclers write almost admiringly of her deeds that she inspired. Two are typical. Enguerrand de Monstrelet says that although the French were saddened by their loss after Joan's capture, the Burgundians and the English were joyous, more than if they had taken 500 soldiers, for they feared and dreaded no captain or military leader as much as they did the Maid. Georges Chastillon agreed, stating that the Maid, surpassing the nature of women, carried out great feats of combat and went to great trouble to save troops from losses, staying back as their leader and most courageous captain. But fortune dictated that this would be the end of her glory, her final combat, and that she must no longer carry weapons. An archer pulled her from her horse by grabbing her cloth, her gold surcoat. A knight who pulled her from the ground was more joyous than if he had captured the king himself. Now, the implication here that she bordered on treason in order to carry on her campaigns. Joan's consistent mission was to deliver France as quickly as possible. Her contention was that she could deliver France within 6 months, and if she was not used, another word of hers, by the king, that it would take 20 years in order to fully drive the English out. So her contention was treason to what? And she believed that it was the king who was bordering on treason to France, not that she was being treasonous towards the king. And her claim against this essentially was that figures like La Tremoille were engaged in negotiations with the Duke of Burgundy, and that the main diplomatic course of the war following 1430, diplomatic course that, it should be mentioned, was successful by the King of France, was to bring the Duke of Burgundy to acknowledge the Dauphin Charles, now Charles VI, as the rightful King of France. And this was achieved, I believe, at the Peace of Amiens. Because this became the main thrust, you can say, of French political life following the coronation at Reims, not the speedy military expediting of the English, you can understand why Joan felt personally betrayed. Otherwise, she believed that the war would carry on indefinitely. Indeed, the constant sieges and battles would also be a reason for the French army to remain under arms during this period, and she could only look in horror at the fact that these parleys and peace treaties with the Burgundians essentially ensured that the French army returned back to the fields and they were disbanded. And it would take, again, decades and decades for the French armies to recoalesce in order to first liberate Paris, liberate Normandy from the French point of view, and finally take the English possession at Gascony-Aquitaine. And so you can understand it from Joan's point of view, but again, against this idea that she had some sort of war lust or warmongering, she also went back to her village of Domremy after the coronation, and she asked to return to a peasant life. There was even the implication that she would settle down and marry. Indeed, at one point she had ostensibly been contracted to marry. She had to present herself to the Bishop of Toul before she became the famous Joan the Maid, in order to prove that there was no marriage contract, and she had to exempt herself. It was one of the first public moments where her intelligence was really attested to. But that became a possibility essentially for her. So if she was going to be under arms, if she was going to be a useful tool for the Kingdom of France, she intended to be used. And if she was not used, she was still going to serve France in her way, so long as essentially she had the right to command armies, which she did, which resulted in Compiègne, which she also prophesied. Part of the mad rush and the speed of Joan's actions was her certain belief that she would die, and die very soon. And so if she was not essentially used by the King of France, all that momentum, all that, again, you can almost say idolatry, that was built up around her cause would dissipate, going back to when I was using the words of Mark Twain to basically explain that France itself was still in a sullen, pusillanimous state, and Joan hadn't been able to incite the French to great deeds without her. And so therefore you can understand from that point of view as to why she would lead to actions which many, again, would interpret as foolhardy, potentially treasonous to the king, and bordering on warmongering. But from the point of view of Joan, if we're going to look back and say that she was a prophet in the pure sense, and that she was sincere in her actions, that she believed that, again, she was enacting the will of God as decisively as she essentially had the means to enact herself. We then come to the whole idea of the soldierly dress, and I'm not going to go into the more modern interpretations of that. I believe all they do is detract from this conversation. But the soldierly dress of Joan of Arc and these symbols of Arthurian kingship, like the armor and the sword and the banner, they were sanctioned as a result of her first ecclesiastical trial at Poitiers, after her being greeted by the King of Chinon. In fact, it was the Jacques Gelou, the Archbishop of Embrun, who I've mentioned, stated that she must wear male dress in the camp. And this was essentially to ensure that some sort of military decorum or sort of military convention was upheld. Indeed, think about the implications of this. Male dress for Joan of Arc was needed for the sake of modesty in the presence of men, because if she were to dress in finery and long sort of splendid garments, etc., she would be open to accusations of immodesty and even potentially indecency. Remember that episode where she was using her sword to bat away loose women from the camp, because so much of her mission, again, was intent on creating a sacramental air for the French army, that they go to confession on the eve of battle and then they take the sacrament. And so if she were dressed like a woman, she would be no better than these loose camp followers, which she despised so much. And of course, if she were essentially, going around the battlefield dressed as a woman, the accusations already being hurled at her by the English and the Burgundians that she were a harlot would have all the more credence because of it. And indeed, she insisted on female dress before the Mass, before the sacraments. In the mold of the maid, she would assume essentially don the attire of a maid, and in battle, she would adorn the attire of a man's dress. And this goes further. In assuming the title of commander of the forces of France, with the grants of land and title by leave of the king, and indeed even the intimation that she were to trump Salic law itself by being able to pass her lands on through the female line, which was a huge part of the cause of legitimate monarchy in France. These led to accusations at her trial of Rouen that she meant to upset the divine ordering of the gender roles and assume emperorship over men in general, where of course the French argumentation that the weaker Joan, the female sex being employed to slay Goliath, was biblical in the sense that it was that God meant essentially to use the weakest of us in order to defeat the strongest, the English dogs. Coming to her trial. When it comes to Joan, a huge, again, error that served as an indictment and trampled all associations with her and her divine visions was the notion that she was being guided by devils. Indeed, there was a huge eschatological implication regarding the Hundred Years' War, that after the glories of Henry V, how can such sanction be given to the cause of France? If Henry V's cause was Dieu et mon droit, God and my right, how then could the cause be so decisively afforded to the enemies? Indeed, going back to Shakespeare, you only need to sort of get a glimpse here of the full implications of the loss of the mandate of heaven for the English. Hung be the heavens with black, yield day to night, comets and portent changes of time and states brandish your crystal trees in the sky, and with them scourge the bad revolting stars. They have consented unto Henry's death. Both Henry in the literal death, Henry V, but Henry and the decimation of his entire legacy by implication. And so in order for the English to rescue their cause, there had to be an entire delegitimation of Joan and everything she stood for. Indeed, we're talking about an era of folk superstitions, and if anything, being a peasant again, that association with folk superstitions and Joan of Arc was all the more poignant, because from early instances, we have Joan and the interaction with the fairies who dwelt in the forest around Domremy. We have an instance of a fabled dragon living in the environs of Domremy, who was indicated to the rest of the village by an inexplicable foul stench that erupted essentially from a certain region that could only be ascribed to the presence of a foul demon. Indeed, this was so pertinent at the time that there had to be some sort of action taken against it, that there was an exorcism pronounced against the dragons, and later a banishment ascribed against the fairies. Part of the association that Joan was not seeing the saints and the angels, but she was seeing devils, is associated with this idea of the seeing eye. Perhaps again, you can even refer to this as a sort of unholy intuition, that all of this intelligence essentially is done in the guise of a foul creature to beguile and tempt men to dishonorable actions, and that by association, everything implicated with Joan is indeed satanic. Indeed, part of the trial of Rouen is that the Archangel Michael, St. Catherine of Alexandria, St. Margaret of Antioch were recast as Satan, Belial, and Behemoth. However, this wasn't consistent, it should be mentioned. There were contradictory conclusions drawn in the final 12 charges of the trial of Rouen, that she had spoken both to angels and she had spoken both to demons. Indeed, the reason I brought up Shakespeare as well is because Shakespeare's writing during the era of the English Reformation. The Church of England has now broken from the Church of Rome. You could almost say, if we're going to look at this from the view of anti-profane history, we're going to look at this from the point of view of revelation and prophecy, that the schism of the English Church from Rome is in many ways actually prophesied by the French victory over the new Davidian kingdom in France. And so the English response to that would be that as Joan is an exemplar of the papacy and of France as a Catholic kingdom, the most Catholic kingdom, it is often referred to as, that Joan is by extension not just any harlot, but she is the whore of Babylon, along with the Pope that she claims to serve. The ironic thing again is here is that with so many interpretations of Joan, you can pick and choose which element you're going to support and which element you're going to condemn, because part of the condemnation of Joan of Arc was that she was not loyal to the papacy. But if you're going to recast this as Protestantism versus Catholicism, then all the better to associate Joan with the cause of the papacy and England as the cause, essentially, of true religion, trumping the superstition of the papacy. And what does Joan essentially have to act against this? Well, the most famous line uttered from her trial, the whole, just to emphasize the whole nature of her trial, and get us to the context there, because I feel I've been sort of skipping over it a bit, is that she is held by the Burgundians after the siege of Compiègne. She is then ransomed to the English, and she is held at Rouen, which is the center of English power in the newly consecrated Duchy of Normandy. But we're talking about the heart of English-French power. We're not talking about English judges, even though the Bishop of Winchester will play quite a conspicuous role in the events here. What I find quite interesting about this image here, this painting that I've propped up here, is that you can see the figure who's probably most prominently featured than everyone. It's not Joan of Arc in her male garb. It's the Bishop of Beauvais, Bishop Cauchon, in gold leaf. And I look at this and I think, if you're going to sort of present the English cause as just, you can't do better than presenting Bishop Cauchon in gold leaf. And he was despised, not just despised by the French, he was even despised by his own side. You can perhaps again think of the unfortunate connections of cochon to couchon, which is the French for pig. This was a morbidly obese, vain, intriguing creature who wanted to be named a cardinal. He wanted to get a cardinal's cap, and he wanted to be made Archbishop of Rouen. He wanted to be one of the most prominent English-aligned clerics. And so this whole judgment was predetermined before the trial even began. There were 60 learned scholars and theologians brought in from the University of Paris, which was then one of the greatest theological establishments in all of Europe. Possibly you can claim Bologna had a sort of greater pedigree, and it was the same with the trial at Poitiers. The reason the trial for the king at Chinon was held at Poitiers was because of the theological school at Poitiers. But in the case of Rouen, the great theologians of Paris were brought in to aid the cause of the Bishop of Beauvais, Cauchon. They had all of these learned men here with judgments and accusations against Joan that weren't made to her. She was not allowed the right of legal consultation. She was not even allowed to know what the charges were presented against her. And everything was designed to essentially allow Joan to stumble and fall after fall after fall, to create a perfect delegitimation of everything she stood for and of the cause of Charles VII. Charles VII was on trial as much as Joan herself was. And the cleverest trick that these great scholars of Paris and the Bishop of Cauchon were able to devise were to ask Joan, "Are you in a state of grace?" And this, with the implications being that if she knew the answer to this question in the affirmative or the negative, it would justify all of the accusations against Satanism which had been arrayed against her. And in response, she said this: "If I were not in a state of grace, may God place me there, and if I be so, may God keep me there." In other words, that was the perfect theological response to that question from an illiterate peasant girl who had been given no legal protection in this case whatsoever. And so as a result of this, trials continued. There were 4 great trials at Rouen, and the charges were refined and they were changed all the time in order to finally get her charged for the act of heresy at the end through an act of trickery. Indeed, everything about the trial is just an implication of how Joan figures in history itself, because we come to the other accusation against Joan, which is the accusation of schism. Because this wasn't a secular trial against Joan of Arc. She wasn't being tried as a war criminal, even though that's a rather modern association, or tried for secular crimes against the English, or perhaps, again, be a better description of it. She was being trialed as a religious icon. And so the cause could be removed as much as possible from the English cause, or the partisan cause of France versus England, and be made a issue for the broader church and the unity of Christendom itself. Now, the issue here, in terms of the legality of the trial of Rouen, is that there had already been sanction to her mission granted by the higher court of Poitiers, because it was provided over by the Archbishop of Rheims, who I mentioned was the primate of all of France, and so outranked the Bishop of Beauvais, who was in the service of the English. And it was ultimately retrialed by the Pope, who had, of course, authority over the court of Poitiers and over the court of Rouen. And another thing that was denied her in terms of her knowledge was that she was not allowed to appeal directly to Rome, even though she had that right, because the Roman court, which would not be partisan to the English, it should be mentioned, would have been able to essentially annul the case, because it wouldn't have been this trumped up kangaroo court that had been designed, essentially very sort of deliberately designed to trick her. Indeed, one of the most insidious aspects of this trial is that she was given a religious counselor, one of the few things that was granted to her. But the religious counselor, the priest, was fully in the pay of Beauvais. And so as she delivered her confession each day to the priest, poured her heart out, the bishop was allowed to listen to everything that was said, so that the priest didn't directly break the sanctity of the confessional. It was simply a matter that the bishop was able to conveniently overhear everything that was said. And so questions were allowed to be proffered to Joan about every aspect of her life, especially her peasant life, and her hearing her voices since the age of 13. And because of that, much of the legal advice, the more sort of impartial legal advice, talked about the injustice of the trial. Namely, I've already mentioned the fact that we had the ignorance and the changing nature of the charges, the absence of legal counsel, the ignorance of right to appeal to the Pope. But because the trial was an attack on King Charles, he reserved the legal right to stand before his accusers, because Charles was accused as heeding the words of an infamous woman, and therefore he was schismatic. But because Charles himself was not on trial, thereby the trial was a farce, because it was only indicting him essentially by proxy. So from the Catholic point of view, the great reversal of this comes from the Bull of Canonization in 1920. And this is Benedict XV's divine dispensation for Joan. Until the end of the trial, and even in the presence of the executioner, the maid never wished to deny her visions and revelations, despite the fact that the judges used any stratagem to have her reject them as false. It was indeed very important for the English to have her declare her visions and revelations as false and untrue before being condemned. In fact, she remained resolute in her depositions. People would always firmly think that her mission had been received from God. That is why the judges, to achieve their aim as a last resort, exposed her to the view of the people and of the executioner. So, on May the 24th of the year 1431, Joan was brought into the square of the sepulchre of St. Owen, where, on a platform built for this purpose, there was the bishop with the Cardinal of Winchester, the judges, the doctors, and many others. The maid was placed on a stand facing everyone, where she could also see her executioner on a carriage in the street waiting for the sentence that the body of Joan be burned. But before that, Nicolas de Saulieu, who perfidiously betrayed the maid, told her that she would be spared from death if she did what was being asked for her. What she was being asked to do was to abjure, and sign a document confirming many of her actions against the English, and essentially validate trials of accusations and charges of schism and heresy. But of course, she could not read, so she didn't know what abjuration meant, and she didn't know what she was signing. Master William Errand started a speech, and against the King of France, among other things, said the following: "O Kingdom of France, you are thought of and called most Christian, and your kings and princes also most Christian. And now by your doing, Joan, even your king, who calls himself the King of France, by following you and believing your words, has become heretical and schismatic." So again, this is the culmination of everything which I've been mentioning, the fact that it's the complete and utter delegitimation of the cause of France by proxy through the damnation of Joan of Arc, who has become so intimately associated with the coronation at Reims. It was necessary for her to become a heretic and a schismatic. But how is she killed, essentially? Because she's abjured for the sake of her life with the presence of the executioner. Well, she is given life imprisonment on the condition that she give up wearing the garb of a man. But this isn't sufficient because the Bishop of Beauvais wants a death sentence for Joan. He does not want her living in some tower which can effectively become the object of rescue plots by the French. And again, if essentially the course of the war played out as we know it, Joan would have eventually been liberated, assuming she wasn't brought over and, say, for example, stationed in the Tower of London. But that would have perhaps served again to delegitimate the English cause, because like the princes in the Tower, the more that the cause of the King of France were proven to be right, essentially by the cause of his victory. Remember, Charles VII, he's given the epithet the Victorious for this reason. Then Joan's continued incarceration will be seen as an act of injustice against the English. So she had to be killed, and elements of her basically needed to be washed away, ultimately with her embers bidden to the Seine, so they would not be worshipped as holy relics of the opposition. And so she consented to the idea that she would no longer dress as a man. She was bidden away to her prison cell, and then her clothes were removed, and she was only given male clothes. And so, again, for the sake of decency and modesty, she had the option of being in a male guarded prison and being naked or wearing male clothes. She wore the male clothes, obviously, and she was accused by the Bishop of Beauvais of betraying her oath that she would no longer wear male clothes, which were again presented to her through that trick, and she was burnt at the stake. The other implication of this, in terms of the accusations of the trial, is that how does Joan, then, being tried and condemned by the church, claim to represent the church? Well, Joan claimed to represent herself as the presentation of the church triumphant, i.e., God and the angels in heaven, rather than the church militant, the Pope and his advocate on earth. And indeed, it's rather fitting that the church militant would eventually absolve her through her retrial in 1456, and obviously the 1869 progress towards canonization. And I've just read a segment from the divine dispensation given her by Benedict XV following her bull of formal canonization. So if this trial were to represent the triumph of the church militant over the cause of Joan, then later the church would find that she was in fact representative of the church triumphant and that she was a saint. And so the course of time and history, from the point of view of the church's point of view, the Catholic Church has resolved that conundrum, and the cause of the Bishop of Beauvais was considered unjust by the same extension. So now it comes to the cause of essentially the justification for her canonization, because I already intimated the fact that she, especially through her military conduct, there are many admonitions you can bring against her. And indeed, there's this whole underlying friction between the partisan cause of France and her representing a divine mission ordained essentially and foretold by prophecy, and reconciling that to the cause of broader Christendom. And what have the French deserved to have such deliverance, and what have the English deserved to be so badly defeated in this case, and the cause of Henry V, that seems so unassailable, be brought so low, as if to essentially elicit images of the time that the English were heralding the end of the universe itself, not simply the end of the cause of their right to monarchy over France. This was a examination by one of her devil's advocates. During the cause of canonization, it used to be the case, I don't believe it is the case anymore, unfortunately, you used to present a devil's advocate, where someone would go around and before the progress of canonization, you would find all the faults and potential sins with a person, so as to not make a mistake when essentially proclaiming that this person is in heaven, because that's what sainthood implies. And this comes from Augustine Caprara, who was one of the devil's advocates against Joan of Arc in the 1860s. Two stages can be distinguished in the life of our Maid. The first, full of glory and admiration, up to the time of her capture. the other of hardships, which found its end by punishment by fire. When she was captured and subjected to the questions of the court, she abandoned her greatness of spirit. The splendor of her divine revelations disappeared, and grave faults obscured whatever surpassing virtue she had at the time. And this is a fundamental notion here, is that the 1456 trial, it was not designed to canonize her. It was designed to absolve her of heresy. And so the implication here is that until relatively recently, in the last 200 years, the assumption is that she made many mistakes during her trial, that she made a huge mistake when she abjured, essentially when she was tricked by the actions of the Bishop of Beauvais and the orator Nicolas Le Salier. And that was the pervading logic. The church had to essentially exonerate itself by absolving Joan of Arc of heresy, and that the trial itself was unjust. But the cause of sainthood is an entirely different affair. And so even from the point of view of the devil's advocate, there is this implication that, again, she had failed many times during the course of her trial, despite all the context that I've established, essentially to say that the whole trial was designed to confound her, and that it is remarkable that she came up with such responses and held herself with such repose, given the extremities that she was extremities that she essentially had to bear the burden of. And so I want to end this segment on Joan of Arc, this presentation on Joan of Arc, which is actually returning to Carlyle and the hero as prophet, because I've already brought up the conscious association between Joan and King David, and that she was David defeating Goliath and reconsecrating France as a God-delivered kingdom, with Charles as its vice-regent. And so what did Carlyle believe on the faults of a prophet? And he ascribed these faults to King David. Who is called there? The man according to God's own heart. David, the Hebrew king, had fallen into sins enough. Blackest crimes, there was no want of sins. And thereupon the unbelievers sneer and ask, is this your man, according to God's heart? The sneer, I must say, seems to me but a shallow one. What are faults? What are the outward details of a life, if the inner secret of it, remorse, temptations, true, often baffled, never-ended struggle of it be forgotten? If is not in man the walketh to direct his steps, of all acts is not a man, repentance, the most divine, the deadliest sin, I say, were the same supercilious consciousness of no sin, that is death. The heart of so conscious is divorced from sincerity, humility, and fact is dead. It is pure, as dead dry sand is pure. David's life and history, as written for us in those psalms of his, I consider to be the truest emblem ever given of a man's moral progress and warfare. All earnest souls will ever discern in its faithful struggle of an earnest human soul towards what is good and what is best. Struggle often baffled, sore, baffled down as into entire wreck, yet the struggle never ended, ever, with tears and repentance, true unconquerable purpose begun anew. And you can say that this is an analogy essentially to the not just the delivery of Joan, but the delivery and repentance of France as a nation itself, and the whole course of the 100 Years' War taken from the point of view of divine history. Poor human nature is not a man's walking in truth, always at a succession of falls, the sort of great Sisyphean conundrum that one walks towards deliverance, but always falls into Hades whenever the boulder comes tumbling down. Man can do no other. In the wild element of life, he has to struggle onwards, now fallen, deep abased, and ever with tears, repentance, with bleeding heart, he has to rise again, struggle again, still onwards, that his struggle be a faith unconquerable one. That is the question of questions. And thank you, everyone, for listening to me. I'll get to your super chats, and if you have any questions, I'll do my best to answer them as well. So thank you for sticking with it. First super chat from Puppy Sect for 50. I'm not sure what currency that is. Thank you. I humbly request an AM reviews of Joan of Arc by Luc Besson. Dustin Hoffman as an Obi-Wan Kenobi-like apparition is hilarious. Is that the one, because I'm not, like I said, I haven't watched any films of Joan of Arc for a very long time. Is that the one with Mila Jovovich? You'll have to remind me. The one by Luc Besson, someone in the chat will know. So you can correct me on that, and then I'll be able to answer your question. TR book 3300 for £5, thank you. I don't have time to give full attention, but please give thoughts on Gilles de Rais if you think it's relevant. I do think it's irrelevant. Yes, Puppy Sect is saying, yes, that is the one with Mila Jovovich. All I can say is, Puppy Sect, is that I saw that film when I was far too young, and it traumatized me as a child because of one scene at the beginning, which is completely anti-historical. And I don't really want to watch it again for that exact reason. That's all I'm going to leave it. As for AM reviews in general, I don't know. I guess I'll have to be inspired enough to really cover a topic. My sort of perfect bait for an AM review would either be to find a wonderful sort of novelty which no one knows anything about, which I think is absolutely wonderful, or at least has far more to commend it and brings a lot more to that era than perhaps we can reasonably expect, or something which is popular, which is actually really insidious, or giving people a complete misinformation regarding the medieval period, like Kingdom of Heaven. As for your question, TR book, what we actually know about Gilles de Rais and Joan of Arc is very little. We know he served alongside her, as did Lahier, as did the great bastard of Orleans, Jean de Dunois, as did the king, as did many of her sort of partisans from Couleur, like Robert de Baudricourt and Bertrand de Poligny. As for Gilles de Rais, we know comparatively little. What we do know is that after the death of Joan of Arc, he is indicted as being a serial killer and potentially a Satanist, and all manner of evil things are associated with Gilles de Rais. I think if I were really to uncover a figure like Gilles de Rais, I think he deserves his own stream, because I was actually thinking of potentially incorporating that as an angle to look at Joan of Arc compared to someone as horrific as a Gilles de Rais, but I couldn't in the end really substantiate that connection when Joan of Arc was alive, so it would have to be its own separate conversation, I suppose. But yes, it is an interesting angle nonetheless, so thank you for your super chat. Alex Roberts, 3634 for $20. Thank you very much. I would hate to ruin your day, AM, but could you elaborate to us who was Kang's? I assume you mean that in a joking sense, not in where did that term originate, Alex Roberts. During the time of Joan of Arc, the two kings in contention were Charles VII of France, who was the son of Charles VI, the Mad King, and Henry VI, who was the son of Catherine de Valois and Henry V, who was only 7 months, I believe, at the time of his ascension, with the death of his father and grandfather, Henry and the Mad King. So Henry was just a child. He was 9 when Joan of Arc was executed at the age of 19, and Charles was in his late 20s by that time. I hope that's what you mean, because if you're talking about where that term comes from, that's a whole different conversation, which I don't really want to go down, but thank you. Michael Hassler for $5, thank you very much. Since you cover historical events, have you considered covering a philosopher of history, such as Spengler, Wilhelm Dithy, or Hegel? Interestingly enough, I have no interest in covering Spengler specifically, as in dedicating an episode to Spengler, partly because many of my fellow collaborators have done so to death. I am far more likely to do one on Hegel. I also want to cover Koselleck at one point. I want to cover Dawson. at one point, I was thinking of doing a potential sort of interrogation of Elton, because I'm very much sort of I wouldn't say anti-Eltonian, but I'm definitely not an Eltonian historian in that sense by any stretch of the imagination. One thing that actually is planned and booked is discussing the philosophy of history of Micer Eliade, which is someone who's very obscure in Anglophone circles, but I think is very significant, especially given the fact that the meta, which I'm alluding to in the stream, has been the role of profane versus the divine in history. And Hegel is also on that list. So, yes, thank you. Anton88 for 10 something. Thank you very much. Doesn't say anything. Polish ambassador for 25. I don't know what that is either. How much did the Anglos pay the Burgundians for her? All the best in 2026. I can't remember the exact amount, but it was a king's ransom, effectively. It was I could look it up now as you have me here, but it was the highest I think you could reasonably ask for a ransom. But it was quite substantial, I think. And you can understand why, for that reason. So, yes, the Burgundian commander was John of Luxembourg, who was a vassal of Philip the Good of Burgundy, and he demanded 10,000 livres, or again 10,000 gold coins is essentially the idea. But the English were prepared to pay for it, but the king refused to, and I've already alluded to as to why I believe King Charles refused to. And my cynical reading is that far better to have a short, decisive intervention for his cause, which emboldened morale and allowed for it to continue unabated, rather than have this child saint who could potentially implicate him in various crimes later, which I think she almost certainly would have had she lived longer. But being a prophetess as she was of course already cognizant of her own fall, which came in the time frame that she had already suggested. Mike Paul is saying Hegel is slop. Hegel is not slop. I would be lying if I said Hegel hadn't inspired much of my framing and reading of history. The question is that Hegel is not obscurantism masked by anti-ideas, and this is coming from someone who isn't anti-obscurantism, funnily enough. So maybe that's why I appeal to his empty ideas, if that's the case. No, there are many ways of reading Hegel. And no, Hegel's reading isn't that it's all subjective. There are many ways of reading Hegel, and my view has never been that history is at all subjective. I think you'll find with this presentation that I've had to deal with a huge amount of literature written about Joan of Arc and the meta about Joan of Arc and how this informed the real history and the real events coming out of this. Indeed, it's all about activating a worldview to be as sort of, I guess, sort of to demean this as much as possible. Because medievalism is so difficult to embark upon because it is entering into a worldview that's, I would say, almost inaccessible to people without any sort of religion, especially non-Catholics. And so it's all about being able to pass and present a worldview in a coherent state to those who would have been living at that time. And so for this reason, I've actually presented a rather anti-presentist historical view of her, which isn't contaminated by modern appellations which have been associated with Joan of Arc. When I talk about her role of profane history and her ideas of being a charlatan, I'm very much using contemporaries in order to understand that point of view, of which there were so many who believed her to be just that. I'm not in sort of inflicting sort of my own any sort of modern biases I have and posing them on Joan of Arc, especially just saying, I'm English, therefore I have to present the English view of Joan of Arc. I presented both the English view and the French view of her. Just to answer some questions now, Berkeley and Stefan Barakta Hello, AM. Would it be off the subject, but would you do a broadcast on 1492 and colonial ventures of Catholic powers? The issue is, Berkeley is that I have far too many things which I want to do and not enough time to do them. Um, because that's a very interesting question, especially regarding the empire of the Indies. I recently hosted a conversation on Portugal's shadow empire in Japan, which actually it should be mentioned cover points of those indirectly because it was framing how to convert a land which Europeans considered to be civilized, as opposed to the natives of Hispaniola, which essentially Christian missionaries believed were in a state of nature, and so had to be treated accordingly, as with the transatlantic slave trade. So I have covered it indirectly, but as for a dedicated conversation, it would be interesting to get into the mind of the conquistadors. This was all part of an idea about Siglo de Oro, the Spanish Golden Age. But like I said, it's a lot of work and not enough time to do it. And to be quite honest, I lose interest in various subjects. I need to have a momentum behind me in order to finally deliver something. So, for example, with Joan of Arc, the momentum was there. So I simply carried forth and was able to achieve it because I've been wanting to do a conversation about Joan of Arc for a very long time. Have you any thoughts of doing a Cesare Borgia stream, a Borgia stream in general? Yes, there was a phase, wasn't there, a few decades ago, where the BBC and there was an international collaboration made two Borgia soap operas back to back. So the Borgias were all the rage in pop culture for a time. As for Cesare Borgia, I have covered the Borgias as part of the Italian Wars. As for the Borgia Pope series, I have many issues with it, but probably not invested enough to actually cover it. And as for Cesare Borgia, to be perfectly honest, I think I actually said it in my Italian War stream. I find Julius II more interesting than Cesare Borgia, and I've already covered Julius II probably as much as I'm willing to. So the answer to that question is probably not. Yes, what happened to the Spanish series? You had planned it a while back, unless I'm misremembering. Yes, it's a huge amount of research, especially in Spanish. And any of you who have been unfortunate enough to listen to my Spanish pronunciation know that my Spanish is absolutely awful, horrific. I have no comprehension of the Spanish language except from things I can simply infer or guess at based on other Romance languages. So that's an issue. It's an issue with everything I want to cover, which is sort of too foreign in that sense. But maybe if I get inspired to do it again, I may go back and do the Siglo de Oro series. How is Joan viewed in modern England? She's just viewed as like a partisan for France during that point. I don't think, especially from people with a lay non-Christian understanding, I don't think they really care about the religious implications or the visions. They just think, oh, she's this weird sort of schizophrenic girl who came about and delivered France to the French. I don't think there's that much to do with this. It's not like the cult we have in France itself. Talking about how the French view Joan of Arc is far more interesting, as far as I'm concerned, compared to how the English treat Joan of Arc, present company excluded. Machiavelli sucks to go. YouTube isn't letting super chat. But yes, thank you anyway. All right. I think that's all I can manage for this week. I'll be covering Intrusible Chamber again next week. I'm going to be talking about, with Theo Howard, Hilaire Belloc and the Ralliement. So the end of French sort of Christian monarchism and the beginning of quote unquote sort of Christian monarchy and sort of Catholic reconciling Catholics reconciling themselves to republicanism, and the theological sort of basis behind that, which is a bit of a whiplash based on this stream, given the fact that I've try to argue that Joan of Arc has to be seen as a legitimist heroine, more so than as a French nationalist. Because if you're going to look at her as a French nationalist, ultimately your understanding will be very, very, very skewed, as I've tried to make out and make perfectly clear in the stream. All right, thank you, everyone.